This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Once again, Dr. Buck Melton, welcome,
Greetings,
Buck.
sir. How are you?
Well, you know, unfortunately, you were not elected president. Is that correct? I don't know how many write-in votes you received, but that didn't happen.
Well, I actually have a story. Some of my students, this is the first time I've ever heard this referred to, but some of my students in 2 different classes said that they had written me in for various posts. I don't think president was one of them, but they said they just couldn't stand what they were offered, so they put my name.
Well, it's great, you know, you're having this influence on young minds. So that kudos to you on that, Professor. Well, we could talk. There are a lot of things going on. We have this huge geopolitical event that has occurred with President Trump, soon to be President Trump, taking over at the helm of the country. And it seems to be a pretty extraordinary turn of events, but such an event, similar in nature, occurred in the early part of the 19th century when Andrew Jackson took over. And maybe we could compare and contrast the two. Do you have any thoughts initially on the comparison and contrast?
Sounds like an excellent exam question.
Oh, yes.
And yes, this is something that's been occurring to me. I've been thinking about it for a great deal as we've seen this, because we've obviously seen a populist upsurge, and little p populism is, of course, a grassroots revolution. I don't think is too strong a way to put it. And this is what clearly swept Andrew Jackson into the White House in the election of 1828. In that regard, you've certainly got a similarity. Another similarity is the thing that made Andrew Jackson so popular, so wildly popular, had nothing to do with politics. It was the Battle of New Orleans more than anything else that turned him into what I sometimes like to call America's first true rock star, certainly its first popular hero. And I think that's one of the main comparisons that we see. There are some big differences, of course, but the people had simply had enough of business as usual and swept in their person in 1828.
Now, the political, I think many people don't appreciate the evolution of the American political system. Starting off after the country received its independence from Britain, there was a very restricted electoral process. Obviously, people in bondage could not vote. I don't think Indians could particularly vote, American Indians, native inhabitants, and certainly women could not. And property owners, really the Caucasian property owners of European descent, they could vote. And even the electorate was restricted. And so something is happening in regards to extending suffrage.
Yes,
allowing Andrew Jackson to come to the fore here.
Yes, and to refer to my classes for the second time in 5 minutes, I have an exercise that I perform in my classes. I have, and it's a little bit skewed. My classes are a little bit too young for this to really be representative, but it still works pretty nicely. I have everyone in the class raise his or her hand, and then I say, if you are black, put your hands down. If you are female, put your hands down. If you are under the age of, and I fudged it a little bit here, 18, it would have been 21, put your hands down. And if you, and I fudged it again, if you neither own nor rent a house or realty, put your hands down. And usually I and maybe 1 or 2 other students in a class of 35 have our hands up. And I say, this is the electorate in the 1790s.
Yes.
And that is not democracy. It was not supposed to be democracy.
And so the electorate, the electoral process, it's just been sort of the evolution of the country in many ways, just extending suffrage, really making huge efforts to include everyone in the political process. And one of the things going on in the 1820s, new states were coming in, and they're the people that allow the states determine who can vote. Is that correct?
Yes, voting is still, even for national elections, is still very much a state process, and so that's what you saw happening at that point. And
So these new states were saying we're going to be there are new places,
frontier places.
The people
yes.
have got sort of Davy Crockett places.
Yes.
The idea that you were a poobah of any dimensions was ill received, and
Yes.
there was a lot of, I guess, the right word might be jealousy of the Eastern establishment, the way business as usual, the elite that was running the country, the educated Easterners that had transatlantic relationships.
Yes, and American geopolitics, really from the time that Christopher Columbus set sail, you see an interesting pattern whereby the people may move west, the population centers move west, but the political power and the economic power tend to lag behind that and stay in the east. And at some point the people get tired of that, and you get a revolution of some stripe taking place.
Now, the big, I guess you could say, political enemy of Andrew Jackson was John Quincy Adams. Is that correct? And
Well,
who exactly, I mean, there was a dispute, I guess, the
Yes.
electoral. Maybe you
Yes.
could discuss how the two did not get along. Andrew Jackson being sort of a lusty man of the people, and John Quincy Adams, a Harvard-educated aristocrat, or at least pretentious in that direction.
Yes.
Comments, and how did that work out?
Yes, I wouldn't call them enemies so much. If you wanted a real enemy of Andrew Jackson, I would have to pick either Henry Clay or Thomas Hart Benton. But certain political opponents, they were opposite numbers. John Quincy Adams, I must say that when Barack Obama a few months ago publicly proclaimed that no one had ever been as qualified for president as Hillary Clinton, anyone who knows anything about John Quincy Adams rolled his eyes, because John
Yes.
Quincy Adams seemed the quintessential president. He had studied abroad. He had been an informal student of Thomas Jefferson back when Jefferson and John Adams were great friends. He had traveled in Europe.
And his father was, of course, the president. Was President John
Yes,
Adams.
yes, which is
right.
a great education on its own.
Yes.
He had been Secretary of State for the preceding 8 years, and probably the greatest Secretary of State that we have ever had. And he just had everything going for him. And then we ran into the presidential election of 1824, which was quite a watershed during our time. There was only one political party left at that time. And so when a single party exists and it has no enemies, then you see that party break down in terms of cohesion. So there were about half a dozen people running for president, one of which was Jackson and another of which was John Quincy Adams.
So much for the era of good feeling. Is that what?
That was how the era of good feeling came to an
that's
end.
it,
Yes.
which is humans in
Yes.
action.
Yes.
Well, what actually happened in that election, and did it embitter Andrew Jackson the same way that possibly President-elect Trump was embittered by
Yes.
his run-ins with politicians?
Yes, it certainly embittered the Jackson supporters. Jackson won the popular vote in 1824, but he did not win the electoral vote. And of course, there's been a great deal of public discussion on the Electoral College and how it works and whether or not it's a good thing since the November election. But when you don't have a clear electoral majority winner, then the top three electoral vote getters, or the top three popular vote getters, go to the House of Representatives.
Is that
for
right?
choice by state.
Is it by
Yes.
popular vote or by electoral?
Well, you've got me. I would say I think it would be popular vote. Now I'm going to have to check that
Check
in
on
on the
that.
but
Right,
the
okay.
top three vote getters, and
Right.
I think it would be popular, go to the House of Representatives, where the voting is not by representative but by state.
Yes.
And so that eliminated a good bit of the slate, and so our three remaining candidates were Andrew Jackson with the biggest popular vote, John Quincy Adams, and Jackson's great political enemy, Henry Clay, who had a lot in common with John Quincy Adams in terms of his political outlook.
And also their socioeconomic situation. So I guess one of the things about the whole populist idea is that the people want somebody that reflects their views, their
Yes.
viewpoints, their cultural affinity. And Andrew Jackson started out as a poor person, but
Yes.
was wealthy. He certainly accumulated
Oh,
a
yes.
substantial
Yes.
number of shekels. And maybe the same situation with differences with Donald Trump. Even though he's very wealthy and born to wealth, but he seems to sort of respond or be similar to every man.
He seems to have,
possibly.
In some sense, he seems to have what Kipling would call the common touch.
Maybe a Homer Simpson kind of feel about it.
Yes, perhaps so. And I would say that Henry Clay, in many ways, was like that as well. As a matter of fact, the phrase "self-made man" is one that is attributable to Henry Clay. That's the phrase he coined to describe himself. They were both self-made men. They were both frontiersmen.
Yes.
Jackson, who had become an adopted Tennessean, and Henry Clay in Kentucky. The difference is that Henry Clay, upon his success, had adopted what we might call a trickle-down Reaganomics kind of view, whereas Jackson still had that common touch to it.
Right, and born in a log cabin, and that sort of the idea of that you're really reflecting the American values of the frontier, albeit, and we could discuss that, of a restricted by gender and ethnicity. So we could talk about, but the at least reflecting the viewpoint of the electorate.
Yes, I think the difference is that with Andrew Jackson, if you were a white male, you were in the club.
Yes.
If you were Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun, being a white male wasn't enough. You had to be an upper crust, educated, wealthy white male.
Yes.
So in that sense, Jackson was more inclusive.
Well, so Jackson was distressed not to win the election.
And because of the collusion between Adams and Clay.
So what happened in the next electoral cycle?
Well, since Clay threw his support behind Adams and Adams beat Jackson, although Jackson had won the popular vote, 1820, almost immediately, the Jackson people began putting together a new political party. And the sole purpose of this party, as originally envisioned, was to get Jackson elected president in the rematch that was going to follow in 4 years in 1828. And this political party is what we know today as the Democratic Party. Institutionally, it is exactly the same party.
And so, in many ways, Jackson is the father of the Democratic
Indeed
Party.
He is,
though,
yes.
Though in contemporary circles, he's not a very popular figure, which is something we could discuss that as we go along.
Yes.
But all right, we have the election of 1828. Jackson is fighting ferociously. Was that a mild election? People were pretty tough with each other.
It was one of the first true mudslinging elections in American history. There had been some ugliness between the Republicans and the Federalist Party back in the 1790s and backstabbing. But the thing that really characterized the 1828 election was the race to the bottom. The idea that the Democratic Party had, and I'm not pointing fingers here because other parties adopted this in the years to come, but the Democrats came up with it first. It doesn't matter to us how smart a voter is or how well educated he is. It only matters that a potential voter is breathing. And there are a lot of those.
Yes, sir.
So if we relax our voting requirements, if we do away with property qualifications, and we simply get as many warm bodies into the voting booth as possible, given Jackson's popularity with the common man, that will guarantee him the victory. And that is exactly what the Democrats did at the state level over the next 4 years. They adopted modern campaign tactics, torchlight parades, buttons, brass bands, mudslinging.
How about corn liquor? Was that part of it?
That too, yes, indeed. And the campaign was absolutely successful. John Quincy Adams didn't know what hit him, and Jackson swept in 1828.
Now, one of the, we get into sort of character issues and suitability for office.
Yes.
And so if you were an Eastern plutocrat, or actually not even an Eastern plutocrat, but a plutocrat in general, he was in many ways an appalling figure.
Yes.
What were some objections that people had just in general about Jackson?
Well, that he was crude, that he was rough, that he was not aware of the popular issues, that the people who supported him were hooligans. Another phrase that comes out of this era is king mob, that Joseph Story of the Supreme Court, when he witnessed this vast throng of ill-mannered, unwashed people herding into Washington for the inauguration, said King Mob has come to town. Interestingly enough, Jackson was not as ill-informed as all that. He had actually served as a United States Senator back in the 1790s. He had served as a commander of the Tennessee militia for many years. So he was not a complete newcomer. He had, I'd say, considerably more political experience than Donald Trump did coming into the White House, and still that was not enough.
Now, is he the person that put the great cheese in the White House, or was that another figure? Maybe that was someone else, but there was a huge cheese that was put in there, and the mob swarmed in to eat the cheese.
I'm not sure it was. I'm not sure it was the cheese, but it was around that time. It was a New England town, I think, that sent the cheese, if I remember correctly.
Some enormous 1,000-pound cheese, and of course everyone mocked the public coming in there to consume the cheese. Free pieces of cheese, and so the mob is descending on the White House to get a piece of the cheese.
Jackson was nearly crushed to death. It was like a nosh pit. I don't know if it was cheese or not, but he was. His friends had to form a cordon around him to keep the crowds out. And then finally, someone had the idea of taking the food out onto, I think it was the South Lawn.
Yes.
And so they opened the windows, and people went spilling out the windows out of the White House to get to the food.
And so of course, this was quite an appalling thing. Now, another thing with Jackson was his domestic situation, and I think his wife Rachel, there was a sense of bigamy about that arrangement that
Rachel,
she had been married earlier.
Rachel had been married to a rather abusive husband, and this was many years earlier, I think around 1801, 1802. You can look me up on that. And so Jackson got Rachel Donaldson away from her husband and managed to get his friends in the Tennessee legislature to procure a divorce. This was back when a divorce actually needed a private legislative act. And then he took her off, I want to say, to Missouri to marry her. And it was only some weeks afterward that they found that the divorce had not become effective when they thought. So, at a purely technical level, yes, you've got a case of bigamy here. And so from that moment on, and they got remarried again after things got normalized. But from that point on, whenever anyone wanted to get Jackson angry, which I can't imagine why on earth anyone would want to get Jackson angry, he would mention that that Rachel was an adulteress, or a bigamist, and that Jackson was an adulterer, and so Rachel became, during this season of mudslinging in 1828, became a target for that. And Rachel, in fact, died before the inauguration. And Jackson swore it was due to a broken heart of being attacked like this.
And I think what I'm getting into is just the general, Donald Trump is the man of the people with substantial affect issues. So many people would say this suitability was not present for either person. And the idea that, well, this is our president, and we'd expect the First Lady to be of genteel, unstained character, and so the idea is, well, okay, that's a compromised arrangement that is not worthy of the country.
Yes. Well, as recently as 1980, there were some eyebrows raised about Ronald Reagan and the fact that he had been divorced.
Yes.
It was not a major issue, but it was certainly commented on, and now, and I think that Donald Trump's marital past is much more scandalous.
Right. We have a lot of issues. So, yes. Well, I mean, nevertheless, the things came up about this just general gender relationships. It's a fair thing to say, although obviously one is like 4th of July fireworks, the other less so. But looking at the eras in which this took place, there was this sort of sense of being less than appropriate.
Yes.
And one of the things about Jackson I've often found remarkable, the number of duels he fought. And so he was a great dueler. I mean, and that's the sort of thing that would resonate in the frontier. If you insulted him, he would shoot you or challenge you to a duel, a little bit like the affect of Donald Trump.
Yes,
so rather than, we can exchange, Trump would say, you would insult me, or I would imagine it was an insult. I'll just insult you 4 times more. In the era of Andrew Jackson, he would just challenge the person to a duel and possibly kill them.
Yes, and he did on several occasions. He got into, and I mean, dueling really became popular. I think it was an effect of our alliance with the French during the American Revolution and the War of Independence, and often it was a pro forma thing. You would waste your shot just to show that you were man enough to stand up to it. But on the frontier, duels were very rough. They usually meant business in these duels. One of Jackson's most famous duel involved knives and horsewhips, and Jackson got shot by Thomas Hart Benton, with whom he served as senator much later on. At that point, the bullet had worked itself out, and Jackson gave Benton the bullet back. And Benton and Jackson were both lawyers. So Benton said, "I think you're the owner now by 21 years adverse possession."
Good.
Yes, the duel with Charles Dickinson, not Charles Dickens, but Charles Dickinson, which arose over a horse race, when Jackson, in very cold blood, gunned down to Dickinson after having been shot by Dickinson.
Yes.
So yes, you're absolutely right.
Well, now let's assess the situation. So it's 1829. Jackson is taking over. It's 2017 soon.
Yes.
Donald Trump is taking over. They both have seemingly things that cause question marks, particularly the aggressive nature of this rough frontiersman.
Pugilistic.
The guy's actually killed 12 people in duels. He's fought with horsewhips. He's a real rough guy. There's a lot of cloud over his just general behavior. He's pretty much, you could say, undereducated. And the issue with Donald Trump is, well, he's even though he touts his time at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of sort of sense he not really educated as many would imagine the president should be.
Yes.
And he's certainly is just prone to all kinds of extreme behavior, and the idea is each person would appear to be ready to take the country into some chaotic arrangement or war as far as that goes. Well, how did it work out for Jackson when he took over? He had an 8 years there.
Yes.
How did it work out? Was he going to be a real, attack, I don't know, Canada? Or what happened?
Yes. Well, based on what we have seen so far, and of course there's some prognostication going on here and expectation, but Jackson broke the mold as to what it meant to be president. He viewed himself. Well, let me back up a little bit. The Virginia dynasty, which preceded him,
yes.
Every president prior to Andrew Jackson had been either a genteel Virginian or an Adams.
Yes.
And so this is usually referred to as the Virginia dynasty. And they tend to be very restrained in their use of presidential power. For instance, the use of the veto power. George Washington only vetoed laws that he clearly believed to be absolutely unconstitutional, and the rest of the dynasty followed his lead on that. Jefferson was so good at working with Congress, he never had to veto anything.
Oh, really?
Yes. So they viewed the center of power to be in the Congress.
Yes.
Jackson viewed the president, that is himself, as the representative of the people, just like a member of Congress.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, he viewed himself as, with the possible exception of the vice president, the representative of all the people, which made him an even better representative than Congress. So he was not afraid to throw his weight around. He vetoed more laws than the entire Virginia dynasty combined.
Yes.
He was very activist in areas where he really probably didn't know much about, for instance, banking. And in doing so, he brought us into one of our first big economic panics, the Panic of 1837. He involved himself in Indian removal, which was certainly not a good chapter in our history, but was very willing.
That's a big deal, isn't it? We're getting some, I guess, retrospective analysis. I think his picture's gone off the $20 bill.
Yes.
He's turned into somewhat of a demon. I mean, many people would say he was an awful person, and which is a change since I came of age.
Yes.
I mean, there are many towns named Jackson, Jacksonville, Jackson, Mississippi. There's Jackson, Georgia. There's Jackson County. There are all kinds of Jacksons everywhere.
Yes.
And he was a great hero. There's Jackson, Tennessee. There's just a touted as a great American figure. And retrospectively, people have attacked him, I guess you could say. Well, all right. So he's in the White House. He's going to be his own man. You could say maybe the first imperial president. Is that a wrong not quite the imperial president, but obviously there are people that would say
he laid the groundwork for it. I would say that that between them, Jackson and Abraham Lincoln laid the groundwork for what would happen to the presidency in the 20th century.
Yes.
The first truly powerful.
Well, all right, so Andrew Jackson, now he did not involve us in any, he was a very militaristic guy. He fought the British. He'd been in a number of Indian wars, which is a whole nother story.
Oh, yes.
But no big, no fights with the Brits, no movement into Mexico. Now, later, the next decade, things happened, but the comments on that? He was not, didn't increase the size of the army. He didn't send the ships to blow somebody up, or did he?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think probably the most belligerent thing he did, other than Indian removal, he was perfectly happy using the army for that, was during the Texas Revolution, the War for Independence.
Yes.
There are claims that surreptitiously, in a plausible deniability kind of way, he did send some troops over the border to help the army of his friend Sam Houston during the Texas Revolution. That was certainly not an official action.
Yes. Now, he had a little dust-up with South Carolina, did he not? And so he's the I'll call him an imperial president of sorts. But South Carolina did not like things happening, and what happened with that little story?
Oh yes, we need an entire new episode to discuss that.
Yes.
But essentially, South Carolina was asserting itself in terms of states' rights, and that's a big
later
can of
to play intellectually to play a role in the Civil War.
Well, and we are starting to see a resurgence of that in the wake of the election of 2016, with talks in California and Oregon of secession.
They've switched from Texas to California and Oregon. Right?
Yes.
Well,
okay. So I must put in a plug here. There's nothing intrinsically immoral about secession. People tend to think so because when we actually pulled the trigger on secession, it had a lot to do with slavery. But there is no automatic connection between the two. The United States was born in secession. But yes, South Carolina decided it was going to nullify federal law that it didn't like, and Jackson essentially said, if you try that, I'm gonna beat you to death. And yet, the thing with Jackson is that since everyone knows that he is surely capable of violence, he didn't have to resort to it very much. It's not quite the opposite of big stick diplomacy. Big stick diplomacy is speak softly and carry a big stick. The opposite would be to scream at the top of your lungs and shake a twig. But that's not Jackson either. Jackson knows that his enemies know he's got a big stick. He has shot people before, he's killed people before, he's strung people up before, and so he doesn't have anything to prove. So when Jackson makes threats, people know that there is a legitimate force behind that.
Well, now
usually the threats work.
Right. Now the issue with Donald Trump, just going with our comparison, is that if you wanted to, maybe I'll say something bad about him tonight. I hope you don't take umbrage with that. But okay, you can't routinely say anything bad about the guy, or he's going to do something horrific to you, and he's going to have tremendous power soon. The fact that he has this sort of persona of being, I'm going to assault you or do something terrible to you, or at least I'll sue you anyway, in any event. And I have control of the Justice Department now. Does that mean that everyone is being? It won't be necessary for him to use the horsewhip. He's presented himself as a person that is just without. You better not insult me or give me trouble. That goes around the world. China, you better not give me trouble, or I don't care if you fly nuclear weapons around. I'm that kind of guy. Or Iran, you're going to do whatever we're going to do. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that.
Yes.
And is that? Can you have a comment on that? Is that a useful tactic, or does that just produce more trouble?
Well, here we run into imponderables, and I don't think we can solve them in the last 30 seconds. Since Jackson had a track record of violence, so far with Trump, mainly we've had talk. So I think the similarity is going to be that, like, as Jackson was a very unconventional president based on past records of past presidents, I think Trump is also going to be very unconventional, and part of that will be due to unpredictability.
Well, we shall see what happens. Thank you for coming tonight, Bucky. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.